myself. Welcome everyone. My name is Will Stronge. I'm the co-director and director of research at Autonomy. We are a think tank focused on the future of work, as I'm sure you know. And I'm proud to kind of moderate tonight's event, which is going to be a discussion of a report called Universal Workers' Rights, which was authored by Phil Jones, who's here. And joining him for a kind of response and Q&A session will be Mary-Ann Stephenson and Tim Sharp. Tim works at the TUC, Mary-Ann Stephenson at the Women's Budget Group, an organisation that we've collaborated with a few times and hope to in the future. The format is going to be Phil talks a little bit about the report and some of the key ideas which he wants to take forward, and will probably feed into some of our research streams going forward. There's going to be some responses from Mary-Ann and Tim, and then I have a few questions for the panelists to try and get some of the information from the report into circulation so that we can have a Q&A with you guys, and it's a general discussion basically. So I would say, yeah, please keep yourself muted and we can have a discussion afterwards. And with that, I will hand over to Phil. Let me just change the speaker view. Phil, take it away.
Great, thanks, Will. And thanks everybody for being here. So to start, I just, really want to say thank you to the other speakers for joining us tonight. I was just saying to them before everybody else arrived that it's great for me after spending the last year writing this report to speak about it with such esteemed guests. So before we get into the sort of the main bulk of it and the main questions with the speakers, I just wanted to talk about the background of the report and kind of summarize a few of its key ideas, particularly for those of you that are not, familiar with the report or indeed with workers' rights more generally. So the key kind of frame or the key policy idea is that workers' rights should be significantly more comprehensive in terms of what and who they cover. So the idea is that they cover more areas of our working lives, but also a greater proportion of those in the labour market. So the horizon, as the title of the report suggests, Universal Workers' Rights, is universality. All of those who work basically in whatever capacity and on whatever kind of contract should ideally have full access to all of the available rights. So Autonomy's idea for a new settlement of rights, it came about before the pandemic, but like so many areas of our economy, COVID kind of revealed the vulnerabilities of an already fragile system. So particularly in the areas of sick pay and childcare, which I'm sure we'll talk about a bit more this evening. COVID, of course, didn't just reveal economic problems. I guess, it entirely exacerbated them as well. We saw the numbers of those on non-standard contracts, such as zero-hour contracts, those who don't have access to the full range of rights, dramatically increase. So basically the pandemic has demonstrated, sometimes in very kind of brutal ways, that our current system of rights is really not up to scratch, that we need to both improve them and make them available to more workers. So this is a key point in the report. How do we extend our existing rights to a larger section of the workforce? So there are a number of ways to do this, but there's a really obvious way, which is lifting the lower earnings limits, which will give around 2 million additional workers access to workers' rights, the majority of these workers being women. So for those not familiar with this legislation, the lower earnings limit effectively means that if your income falls below, I think it's £120 a week, the worker and their employer basically don't make the necessary contributions that give access to workers' rights. So in this regard, what it basically means is our current system effectively punishes those who are in low income, insecure jobs and rewards those in long-term, well-paid positions. So kind of as I show in the report, a more rational and just settlement would need to decouple access to rights from hours and income and types of contract. So another way to make sure that more people have access to the full range of rights would be to phase out zero-hour contracts, particularly in those contexts where there's no operational justification for their use. basically because workers on these contracts are often on shorter hours and are given the status of worker as opposed to employee, they end up with a limited range of rights. So this could give a very large cohort access to rights. It's a little over 900,000 workers currently on these contracts. So if you add that 900,000 to the 2 million that are below the lower earnings limit, we're almost close to 3 million extra workers that could be being covered by our current settlement. And then additionally, we also need to try and make sure that the self-employed have better access to rights. The UK is actually something of an outlier in not having basically any rights system for the self-employed. There are lots of European countries where at least some of the available rights are extended to self-employed workers. And this would mean probably having to sort of adapt our national insurance contribution system and also our income tax systems as well, which is something I go into the report a little bit more deeply. I probably won't go into that too much tonight, unless people during the Q&A session would like me to kind of talk through that a bit more. The report, though, is not just about how we cover more workers or about improving the current rights that exist. But it's also about dramatically altering our current system with a whole new range of rights, which are fit for some of the crises and challenges that we've been facing in the 21st century. I'm just going to bring up a couple of slides to show you now, which just give you a bit of an overview of these rights. And once I've done that, we can then move on to the responses from the speakers. Just 1 second while I get this sorted. Okay, has everybody got that?
Yeah, we can see that, Phil, yeah.
Right. So the first of these new rights, we've titled A Right to a Livable Planet. And the basic idea is that, the ecological crisis is also a crisis of work, which is not, it's not a controversial thing to say. The basic idea behind this is that we all workers should be given an allocated number of paid work hours each year to engage in activities that are beneficial to the planet. So this might include community tree planting and local rewilding. It might be setting up local repair cafes, or it might be not involving work at all. It might, simply be taking eco days where workers engage in activities that are more sustainable than their actual jobs. So the second of these rights is a right to childcare. And this is particularly pertinent in kind of the context of the pandemic. So I think as many people here are aware, being parents, that finding sort of good, affordable childcare has long been a problem. And basically the idea of a right to childcare will give every individual, whether currently in employment or unemployed, access to state-funded childcare, which will be free at the point of access. This is not a particularly new demand. It's not an original demand on our part. It's something that feminists have been arguing for the last sort of 40, 50 years. And it's something that I sort of feel like in other countries there has been significantly more sort of progress on. The UK is, again, on this issue, is very far behind countries such as Norway and Sweden, which have a much more progressive policy around this issue. And then the third of these rights is a right to disconnect, which is something that Autonomy has been working on. It sort of more broadly. We've got a larger report which deals with the right to disconnect, which sort of looks more deeply at the kinds of problems that workers have faced during the pandemic, having moved from the office to home, and the ways in which this has impacted their work-life balance. And one of the things that we're talking about in that report, and again here, is something called hidden overtime, where workers basically end up doing unpaid work in the evenings and weekends, simply by people getting in touch, maybe their manager getting in touch and asking them to do a little bit here or there, or maybe a phone call late at night about some work that's going to be happening the next day. The idea of a right to disconnect is that it becomes that all workers basically have the right to switch off, basically, at the end of the day, switch off their phones, switch off their laptops, and not be engaged in any sort of work-based activities during the evenings and weekends. And then the final of these new rights is also basically particularly important in relation to remote work, and the fact that lots of people have found themselves during the pandemic with less than satisfactory working conditions in their own home, where they might live in, say, a studio flat with a bedsit, and it means working in the same room that you sleep in, or you're doing your cooking in and stuff. So this is basically the idea that there should be now a right to decent workspace, and that workers basically there should be available to workers publicly funded and publicly available workspaces in urban centres, and also that these workspaces should provide some basic equipment as well. So whether that might be some laptops, or it might be sort of additional kind of things like keyboards and things like that, which are very costly. One of the things that's happened during the pandemic is that workers have had basically a great deal more sort of financial outgoings, having to spend money on things like electricity as well, and broadband. So these things should also be covered within a right to decent workspace. Oh yes, and there's one more as well. So right to development, this is the final of the new rights, and this is basically based on an idea which actually somewhat interestingly comes out of Google, who give their sort of very much privileged staff 20% of their working hours given over to time which is spent on tasks outside of their normal job. So this means that they've got time to develop new projects. It means that they've got time to innovate new ideas, which, from Google's perspective is very good for the company. But what we're saying basically is this should be available to all workers, and that the right to development shouldn't just cover projects that are that are going to benefit the company, but also work that simply enriches or activities that simply enrich the lives of the staff as well. Okay, so that's the new rights. We'll talk about them a little bit more as the evening goes on, but I think it's now time to hand back to Will and get some responses from Mary-Ann and Tim.
Great, thanks Phil. We've started the start of the evening with a propositional kind of stance, which is what we prefer at Autonomy. We like to kind of produce those visions of the future of work. But we've invited Tim and Mary-Ann to pick out anything from the report which they find interesting and have some initial responses before we move to some questions. So I will let's start with Mary-Ann first. As we have fewer speakers, you have a bit more leeway in terms of time. So I'll hand over to you, Mary-Ann.
Thanks very much, Will, and thanks very much for that presentation, Phil. That was really, really interesting, and not surprisingly, there's a lot in there, particularly around childcare, that we at the Women's Budget Group very strongly agree with. I suppose for me, the thing that really struck me when I first read the report was the point that you make at the beginning about how we have a system of workplace rights that's designed for a world of work that no longer exists. And the idea of kind of full-time, long-term jobs where people are paying national insurance contributions, employers are paying national insurance contributions, and as a result, people have entitlements to certain rights and sick pay and so on. And the thing that struck me about that, it's not just about a world that doesn't exist in terms of the type of work, it's also that it was based on the idea of the male wage earner and then other members of their family being dependent, and that women workers were secondary earners and were working for, you know, what people used to refer to as pin money, so didn't need the same employment rights because their employment was less important. And so in a way, the sort of lower earnings limit and the exclusion of certain people, both from having to pay national insurance contributions, but also from entitlement to the benefits that go with it, is similar to things like, you know, the married women's stamp with pensions, where women were able not to pay the same level of national insurance contributions, but didn't have the same pension entitlement, and that, you know, coming back to haunt a generation of female pensioners. And I think that links quite well with your recommendation around the right to childcare, because actually, when we're thinking about rights in paid work, I always think it's really important to recognise the intersection between paid and unpaid work. And so, you know, the reason why, for example, 70% of people earning under the lower earnings limit are women is because women earn less than men. And one of the primary reasons for that is because of the unpaid work that women do. You know, women do 60% more unpaid work than men, most of it either care work or domestic work associated with care, which leaves less time for paid work, which is why women earn less and own less and are more likely to be poor. And so when we're thinking about tackling this problem, we need to think not just about the systems of national insurance contributions, the systems of entitlements, but also about what we do about unpaid work. And our former chair, Diane Elson, always talks about the need to recognise, reduce and redistribute unpaid work. And so the recognise is to recognise in your systems that's the reason why women earn less. The reduce is through things like free universal childcare, and we've modelled the costs and benefit in terms of increased taxation and lower social security claims from free universal childcare, but it's also about redistribution, and that's about redistribution between women and men. And so I think one of the points that you make in the report, although you didn't have a chance to talk about it here, maybe we can go into it in more detail later, is around maternity, paternity and parental leave, and the importance of having leave policies that actually support and encourage men to take on more of a caring role, because we know from what happens in Scandinavian countries where there is better leave entitlement for men, that actually that critical point after a couple become parents often sets a pattern of responsibility for care that the parents didn't actually intend to have. You know, most couples go into parenthood thinking that they're going to share care more equally than their parents did, and discover themselves suddenly back in the 1950s, where men are only entitled to 2 weeks of paternity leave. And that sets a pattern of who is the primary carer. So I think it's really important to see the recommendations in your report as part of a package, you know, rather than cherry picking one or another, that they all fit together. I'll stop now because I want to, you know, hand over to Tim, but those are the sorts of things I'd like to be able to explore a bit more in the discussion, that kind of intersection between paid and unpaid work, and then how that leads to us having a system which isn't fit for the modern world of work, both in terms of the jobs we do and in terms of the fact that nearly half the workforce are now women.
Great, thanks, Mary-Ann. Some really useful opening suggestions, and I think actually, or comments really, and I think actually that I do think it's true actually that the report, I think one of the messages of the report, which I don't think Phil mentioned, but really is that it's about the whole settlement and how that they all intersect, and it's not that, yeah, the crisis of work is multifaceted and how the response needs to be as well. There's no one weird trick. I'm going to hand over to Tim to hear his reflections before we move to some questions for the panelists. Tim, over to you.
Thank you. I think that what struck me with the report is how the concerns voiced in the report are quite similar to a lot of things that the TUC has been focusing on, and particularly that concern about how the labour market has been developing and whether the system it exists, whether it actually works for many workers. And we do a lot of work trying to establish how many people there are in insecure work, and we estimate there's about 3.6 million workers on 0 hours contracts and low paid self-employment and things like agency work and casual contracts, and that's been reflected by this sort of hollowing out of the labour market and a big growth in jobs at sort of either end of the labour market, and it seems to have reinforced a lot of the structural inequalities that already existed. So we worked out that BME women are like twice as likely to be on a 0 hours contract as a white man, and the workers on insecure sort of contracts are particularly vulnerable to being denied key rights. Things like, and as you pick up a lot of this in the report, but we've talked about the fact that 2/3 of those on insecure work receive nothing when they're off sick, and that became a sort of issue that for a while got attention during the pandemic. And I think one of the unfortunate things is that when we had for a while, we had a clap for carers, and it appeared that there was a rethinking about what roles do we value in society, and it became very apparent a lot of those in insecure forms of work, doing things like care work and deliveries of various kinds and retail work, that suddenly society realized how essential they were to the functioning. We might have a bit of a reappraisal of that, but I think some of the sort of immediate political opportunities on that have been missed. I think you touch on this in the report that there's a huge complexity in employment rights, and that's something that some employers are very willing to exploit. So the phenomenon of false self-employment, or people simply being misled as to their rights. You're on a 0 hours contract, therefore you don't get holiday pay, is the sort of thing that workers come up against quite a lot. So I think one of the things that struck me, and I think we should think about in sort of conjunction with the sort of fleshing out of rights that you've set out, is issues of enforcement. I think that to enforce your rights, you have to know them. You have to have the resources, the time and resources to take your issue to a tribunal, or have the backing of a union in order to do that. And for so many workers, the precarious end of the labour market, that's simply not the case. So I think we need to think in conjunction with these sort of issues about, I guess, some of the more sort of tedious things, but resourcing of employment tribunals, about trade union access, so that they can help resolve some of these issues in the workplace. And I think that we can point to, and I guess talking up my own book, but there's plenty of evidence from around the globe that where you have strong collective rights, you have strong trade unions, you therefore have greater equality and other positive spin-offs, and you have mechanisms for thinking about and resolving some of the issues that are thrown up by the way that the labour market evolves and work evolves as well. I'll just stop there. Thanks, Will.
Wonderful, thanks, Tim. Okay, so we have a certain set of questions which we want to kind of throw at the panelists, maybe for a few minutes each, just to kind of speak to. I guess maybe I'm going to twist one of these questions. I think so. Phil, I'll go to you first for this one. What would you? I mean, I'm going to try and make these slightly more targeted questions around. What do you think are the most, let's say, pernicious problems with the current labour market? So you mentioned, for example, the low earnings limit, but we're looking the key settlement, the settlement of workers' rights that we have. What are perhaps the real sticking points that, like, if solved, would really be transformational beyond perhaps the lower earnings limit, basically? And then I guess the follow-up question is, these real kind of vulnerabilities in the workers' rights settlement that we have right now, how did the pandemic reveal them, perhaps in the most obvious ways? And we'll start with Phil, and then we'll go around. Basically, I feel bad for the final speaker, who'll probably have all their bits covered, but maybe we can each pick out different bits, ideally. So we'll start with Phil.
Well, just to reiterate something Mary-Ann said a minute ago, which I also note in the report, is that the overarching problem, it seems to me, the overarching sort of pernicious problem is that our settlement of rights is completely out of date. It's barely been updated in a meaningful sense over the last sort of 4 decades. And the world of work has changed an awful lot over those decades. You have to think that sort of temporary or so-called flexible arrangements, have increasingly become the norm since the late 1970s. But we still have in place systems like our settlement of rights, our national insurance contributions, our income tax, that need radically reforming, or indeed in the case of national insurance, perhaps scrapping entirely. What we've seen since 2008, in particular with the rise of digital labour platforms, and this speaks to something that Tim was just saying, is unscrupulous companies exploiting loopholes in these systems. Bogus self-employment status is one thing. It has allowed these companies to almost entirely shirk the responsibilities of acting as proper employers, and has meant their workers are going, in some cases with companies like Deliveroo and Uber and on micro-work platforms and crowd work platforms, they're going without rights entirely. So it's not just that they have limited rights like zero-hour contract, people on zero-hour contracts, they have effectively no rights. I mean, you'd have to say in the context of the pandemic, this has had detrimental effects, not only on the individual workers, but on society as a whole, really. I mean, if you think about the lack of statutory sick pay, for instance, available to delivery drivers, this meant that many workers had to go into work even when contagious with COVID-19, which is not only dangerous for them, but it's dangerous for their workmates and customers. It's dangerous, for the families of those workmates and customers. It's not a policy which is conducive to a situation in which you need people to stay at home if they're sick. So what I'd say that one example kind of demonstrates is that our system of rights really is not up to the challenges of an event such as a pandemic. It's not really up to the challenges that we can expect to face in the coming decades around the climate crisis. And as we can see, crises are becoming increasingly a part of day-to-day life, which should prompt us to seriously transform our rights so that they can cover more workers and do so in a more effective way.
Great, thanks, Phil. Let's give Tim the first bite of the cherry on this one as well. So I guess things like which you would, let's say, perhaps immediately change, Tim, and shift, and then also, what things the pandemic really surfaced that you thought was particularly shocking, which obviously needs to be remedied.
I mean, the way that I would think about a lot of these issues are around issues of power in the workplace, and I think that was revealed again in the pandemic. I mean, some of the more shocking examples about how care workers were unable to insist on fair working practices, because if you are on a 0 hours contract or a short hours contract, whatever, you're reliant on your boss giving you future shifts, and you're not in a position to sort of argue with them and sort of make ultimatums. And I think that was revealed starkly. And I think that if we're going to address some of these issues, then we need to think about how do we tip the scales back towards workers. And I think we can look at some useful examples. I mean, if you look at Spain, it's improved. It's got a new riders law that initially came in over the summer, and I think has now been implemented, which presumes, for instance, delivery riders to be employees entitled to access to various rights. One of the things we're keen on is something here where you have got that assumption that somebody is. Well, we were keen that worker, whether you got worker status or employee status, that you have the same basic flow of rights. We also think that should be coupled with a presumption that you are an employee or a worker, unless an employer is able to prove otherwise. I mean, I think one of the things I'm slightly cautious of is we know from our unions that there are plenty of people in self-employed work who are actors, who are musicians, who are working in TV technical roles, that are happy with self-employed status, often because they also have the protection of various collective deals from or agreed with the unions and employers. So we don't want to cut across them, and we don't want unintended consequences. But we do think that we need to have a look at that again. We need to have that basic floor of rights, and then we need to do some work to have a unified sort of worker status. So you can't have this system we have now where employers can effectively manipulate the system and deny people of some key rights they've got.
Thank you. And Mary-Ann, same to you.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, Will, the person who goes last ends up saying, I just agree with what everyone else said. There was a couple of things that struck me really early on in COVID. I remember in, I think it was British Columbia in Canada, where one of the first things that they did was bring care workers into the public sector. So care workers who had been working in private care organizations. And that was, I mean, it was actually a public health measure, but it was also about to improve the way in which that care work was organized. You had, you know, similar to the UK, large numbers of people in kind of insecure contracts, often working for multiple employers, you know, multiple kind of micro jobs moving around here, there and everywhere, and moving traveling quite long distances. And people needing care, sometimes seeing multiple carers and not having, you know, care is a relational service. You need to be able to build a good and trusting relationship with the person who's caring for you, which means that you need to not be seeing different people every day. So to actually make that system work better, people were brought back into the public sector, which I think is evidence of some of the failings within the private sector and the care sector. And I think that's, you know, probably the worst thing actually that happened during the pandemic was about care workers being forced to work in conditions without adequate personal protective equipment, unable to take time off work when they were sick. And we saw the results of that in the appallingly high death rates. And as Philip said, you know, these are not just issues for workers themselves. I mean, that would be important on its own, but they're also issues for the wider economy and the wider society. I wanted to say a bit more about self-employed workers, just because that isn't something that we've talked about so much, because I think, you know, one of the important points in the report is the way in which self-employed workers are excluded from a whole range of rights, and the need to kind of rethink how we ensure that self-employed people get sick pay, get maternity pay, and so on. Because I think historically self-employed workers have been seen almost like, you know, small business owners, that, you know, it's not the responsibility of the state to provide healthcare for small business owners, but actually you've got large numbers of people in quite low paid jobs who are classified as self-employed. And, you know, self-employed men aren't entitled to any paternity leave. They're not entitled to transferable, you know, shared parental leave, which is really transferable maternity leave. There's no equivalent of maternity allowance, which self-employed women can have. And that actually what we need to see is as is recommended, systems where, rather than thinking in terms of kind of national insurance contributions and different levels of national insurance contributions, you know, people are making contributions to universal benefits in accordance with their income, and that everybody's entitled to those. And some of those benefits are already paid through employers, but via government. I mean, statutory maternity pay, for example, employers can reclaim the bulk of it, and for small employers, more than the full amount from the government. So that, you know, there is already a precedent in place that says that actually this is a social cost and will be shared across the whole of society, because children are a social good. And therefore we are all responsible for ensuring that people who are caring for new babies actually have an adequate income to live on, whether or not they're employed or self-employed.
Yeah, thanks, Mary-Ann. That's, yeah, it's a really important point. I think, like, there's something I think what we're edging towards often in tonight in these discussions as well, is that, yeah, when we talk about a new settlement for workers' rights, we're really also talking about a new social settlement, full stop. And like, you know, we have this the subject of tonight is not really also just to talk about welfare, but obviously we really are talking about worker welfare. And when we start thinking about this kind of blurring between employed and self-employed, and then also between, you know, life in work and life outside of work, then the question of welfare really does rear its head. And so I think, you know, at Autonomy, we're all very committed to thinking about policies which help strengthen kind of prosperity in work, but also allowing for that strong social security kind of system outside of work, so you kind of no one falls through the cracks. So I think that's kind of the kind of almost like the shadow report of this report would be something around a new social settlement, full stop, which I think is something in all of our minds. Okay, actually, I mean, in fact, you actually touched on the second question I had, Mary-Ann, which was around improving our existing rights, and also some of the challenges we might need to face. And also Tim's spoken to my fourth question, which is the role of trade unions already. So I think I'm trying to think of, I think maybe it's worth kind of opening up actually to see if, I think there's at least a super long question in the chat. I might ask Tom to unmute, and then maybe you can say your question out loud. Is that okay? Tom, can you unmute yourself, or actually do I need to do that for you? Let me look. I can unmute you. Here we go.
Hello?
Yeah, great. I can hear you. Can everyone hear him?
Hi.
Yeah.
Oh, cheers. So basically my question, I want to know whether you think work is the best way to secure people's livelihoods, and is the amount of people stuck in insecure work and in work poverty, like people aren't being paid enough to live on. So is the solution to fight for more labour rights, or do we want to move towards people being able to live separated from wages? And I asked this because I was at a Resolution Foundation event the other day, and Torsten Bell, the chief executive of it, was talking about universal basic income as an alternative to work. But from my perspective, the UBI would be good for work in that it acknowledges the distinction between paid and unpaid labour, which is obviously good from a gender perspective. It's like the old thing, wages for housework. And then it also gives people a better starting position to demand better rights at work and achieve more fulfillment from work. Because, you know, a lot of people are fulfilled at work and they get value from their work, and having a better, more secure financial starting position could embolden them to demand that from employers.
Thanks, Tom. I mean, I didn't know how on message that was when I mentioned welfare and the world of work, but you kind of took that to the next level of the question. I think so. Let's talk about that. Let's broaden the question out to the question of the relationship between welfare and work then, and how there's a lot in there. There's a question around how best to have kind of, let's say, prosperity, how to increase livelihoods. But there is a question also around the relationship between welfare and work. I don't know, Phil, if you want to speak to it first, while I'll let the others kind of think on Tom's quite long comment. But it was a very useful one. Yeah. I think it's one I often ponder.
So it's interesting that you bring up universal basic income, because actually universal basic income is kind of what I had in mind when I was thinking about the title for this report, of trying to sort of capture the spirit of universality. And I think, in answer to your question, Tom, I think it doesn't need to be an either or. I don't think we need to decide whether it is universal basic income or whether we focus on workers' rights. I feel like those two things can go hand in hand. It's the same thing when we're talking about universal basic income and universal basic services. Have both. I think if we're going to be, making demands, then we should be demanding all of those things, really. In terms of sort of thinking about in-work poverty and insecurity, and whether that, whether we should be focusing on that in terms of universal basic income, rather than workers' rights. My point would be, I suppose, that, one of the things that's captured within workers' rights is the minimum wage. So one of the things that you can do by adapting, the workers' rights settlement is also adapt the minimum wage so that it actually provides a better base level for workers than it currently does. So I don't think that's excluded from workers' rights necessarily. I think as some of the answers that Mary-Ann has given so far, and as Will was saying a minute ago, the line often between rights and welfare is fairly blurry on this sort of stuff, and really it's you know, you don't have to sort of pick necessarily one or the other. You kind of you're sort of working with both at the same time. I don't know if any of the other speakers have got anything to say on this issue.
Yeah, let's move on to the other two. I mean, Mary-Ann, your thoughts? Although I know you've already spoken to us already, maybe there's something, maybe yeah, that allow you the space to speak.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because we've got a report coming out and an event shortly on social security and gender in a Green New Deal, and one of the things we look at is different social security models that people have been proposing, and you know, UBI and minimum income guarantee and so on, and you know, our conclusion is actually that the social security system that we have does a number of things and has a number of objectives, and that it's very difficult to have a single kind of one-size-fits-all solution to meet all of those different needs, and so that there is definitely a role for universal benefits, you know, unconditional benefits for some things, but it doesn't necessarily meet the full range of what people's needs are. And if you particularly look at disability benefits, for example, where you've got additional costs as a result of being disabled, and UBI, I mean, you know, UBI can be something that you build on top of, but it doesn't necessarily solve everything. But in certain areas, for example, around support for children, I mean, we effectively had a system of UBI with child benefit. I mean, it's no longer universal because there is a means test involved, but that was a sort of recognition of the need to collectively recognise the importance of support for children. And similarly, I would argue for a kind of a universal citizenship pension, which would be, you know, a form of UBI for retired people. But and I agree very much with Phil that it's not an either or, that you need a decent social security system and you need decent workers' rights, because, you know, there is a concern if you look at what's happened with tax credits and now with universal credit, that actually employers can see the benefits that people are entitled to as an excuse, as a need not to deal with low wages, because actually low wages are being topped up elsewhere. And I think there are risks of letting employers off the hook, actually, and that people should be paid decently for the work that they do. They should also have security, whether they're in or out of paid work, and that's a different thing. But I don't think UBI is a solution to problems of low pay and job insecurity. I think we need better pay and stronger trade union rights.
Thanks, Mary-Ann. And I suppose just before I move on to Tim as well, I think there's somewhere in the middle between Tom's comments and what Mary-Ann is saying in a way, which is basically that the two aren't mutually exclusive, but at the same time, the two can. We don't want to be herded into a situation where we say we can't have strong cash social security systems and decent pay. We want to say, in fact, that actually strong social security systems and decent pay and work and decent trade union representation are what we basically want on a wider scale. And that's what we have had before. Traditionally, when we have had stronger social security systems or less punitive ones, we've also had strong trade union representation and stronger voice in the workforce, because there's no threat of unemployment being particularly pernicious and horrible. But I'll move to Tim. Tim, your thoughts on work, welfare, and the kind of relationship between the two going forward?
In the sort of the general consensual mood of this discussion so far, I would agree with everything that Mary-Ann said on stronger pay and trade union rights. I would say this: watch me teach her along the fence on this one. There's a range of perspectives in the trade union movement on universal basic income. I mean, I think we've done some work on this, and we think it's the sort of thing that responds well. It does respond well to some of the problems thrown up by insecure your work. The fact that it sort of responds automatically as people might cycle in and out of work is definitely a potential positive aspect. I think we would have concerns though around things like targeting. It looks like the sort of thing that potentially beneficial for low and middle income earners, but doesn't do much for the very poor. And that's a concern. I think we have some of the concerns about the political difficulties of sort of higher taxes required to fund it, and whether politicians would have the sort of mettle to deliver those. So I think we've looked at it, and and we think there are pros and cons, and that's where I'm going to leave it.
Wonderful. I think you dance along that fence perfectly, Tim. Okay, so I'm going to open up again to any other questions from the floor for any of our speakers, or to Phil from the report, granted that not a load of people read think tank reports. So you have an opportunity now to ask the author literally anything about the report to find out about it, and he'll be happy to answer. So yeah, or is there anything from the panelists that they want to kind of bring up from in particular, which they haven't been able to so far?
I think one of the things we haven't touched on, if I can raise it, is I thought it's that starting to look at some of the issues around technology, and that's one of the issues that we're kind of trying to grapple with. It's like the extent to which technological developments are impinging on workers' rights in the workplace, and it's quite a hard topic because it's not always very evident. Even where there are issues arising, it's not always obvious to the workers concerned. So we're thinking about things like intrusive surveillance, the use of algorithms to hire, fire, allocate work, and the right to disconnect. It gets good aiding in here, and that's something else where we're really interested in talking about, and particularly as it's a sort of issue that cuts right across the sort of earnings spectrum, that it's an issue for low paid workers having to stay glued to devices for their next shift, and also for sort of higher paid workers who find they're getting demands for emails responses at all times of the day and night. And I think it's really good that you've sort of picked up on these issues, and we think sort of one of the things we're keen to explore is whether there should be greater workers' rights, for instance, to your data. So what data does your employer hold on you? What rights do you have to it? How do you challenge some of those things? I mean, it's getting, there are some court cases emerging with companies like Uber, and how they allocate work and discipline workers and so on based on the data they have to hand. But I think it's a kind of an emerging area that we're keen to do a bit more thinking on, and we're keen to get ahead of the game, because often in some of these cases, employers don't really understand the algorithms they're operating. It's not necessarily just an deliberately oppressive thing. They don't get it. And so I think that's one of the really important issues to look at when we're thinking about the sort of future of work and some of the issues coming through.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, actually. Sorry, Mary-Ann, we're going to jump in.
Just to say that I very much agree with that, and particularly on the issue of algorithms and recruitment. And, there is plenty of evidence to show that, there's, again, probably unintentionally on the behalf of employers, but if, for example, you're setting up algorithms that recruit people on the basis of keywords used in an application compared to the keywords used in an application of previously successful employees, you tend to just recruit a load of white men. And that's, that's a real problem. But one of the things that I wanted to explore a bit with Philip was this thing about the right to disconnect and the right not to be receiving emails outside your standard working hours, because it's something that we've spent quite a lot of time thinking about internally at the Women's Budget Group, because we also are very committed to flexible working. And for some of us with children, actually working non-standard hours is the way that we're able to do our job. And so we're much more focusing on the need not to reply, and the fact that nobody should have kind of email notifications on their phone, for example, and that people can switch off Slack notifications when they're not working and all of those sorts of things. But that actually we're not going to require people not to send messages outside certain hours, because for some of us, actually, if you have a sick child, or if you just want to go to a parents' evening, or you want to take your child somewhere, you might take some time in the middle of the day and be working later in the day. And, you know, during the first lockdown, you know, the way a lot of us coped who had children that we were also having to homeschool was to start very early and finish very late and do the home educating in the middle of the day. And so, but how you do that, because you can still, I mean, I'm conscious of this as a director of an organization, I can say to people, I'm not expecting you to reply. And I've got this little bit at the end of my email saying I send this at a time that suits me and you don't have to reply outside working hours. But you also become aware, particularly for maybe more junior staff or staff who've started more recently who weren't there during the sort of real COVID stress times, that they get these messages and think, oh, should I have picked this up? And even if you're saying, well, no, you shouldn't, and no, you don't have to, how do you create a culture where people can both work flexibly and have the right to disconnect? And it's not entirely straightforward, I think. That's a cultural thing rather than a legal rights thing, I think.
And then just to speak to that, it's difficult. I mean, I completely understand what you're saying. It's very difficult to find that balance between flexibility and structure, and there being some definition between work and leisure still. And one of the things that happened in France when they implemented the legislation is that there were representatives from unions for different sectors who would be working out on an individual basis with different sectors the degree to which a right to disconnect could work and would indeed be desirable. So it wasn't a one-size-fits-all approach. It was trying to figure it out, you know, often in sectors, but I think also often in individual firms. Of course, the risk with that, as far as I see it, is that it means that because of the power relations that Tim was talking about earlier, that can often mean that the employers have the final say on whether a right to disconnect is implemented or not. So the reason why in the longer report that Autonomy has written on the right to disconnect that we decided in the end not to propose the sort of the sectoral version of policy implementation was for that reason. It was because we were worried that there was the possibility that it would just be exploited. Basically, there would be loopholes that would be easily exploitable. But that doesn't take away from the fact that there is a difficult negotiation between giving workers the flexibility that they desire and need, while at the same time maintaining the sort of the parameters of the working day. Quite a few studies during the pandemic have shown that that people working from home, their hours went up significantly each week, significantly over the course of the pandemic. So I think it was during the first lockdown, showed that by the end of that lockdown, people were doing on average about 5 to 6 more hours a week of work. And that was largely down to the fact that they were working from home and that there weren't any boundaries, but also because of childcare duties complicating and expanding the working day. So I think a right to disconnect, the emphasis always has to be on, as you said, Mary-Ann, on the worker having a right not to answer, not it just being this one-size-fits-all approach where work can't take place past a certain time or whatever. It's about the worker having that, basically having that autonomy to make decisions.
I think just to jump in real quick, I think in our own paper on this, we did have the kind of like the light version is you don't have to respond. The strong version is you have a right not to be pestered. And I think the right not to be pestered is the one which is potentially constricting for organizations where, people will need to be sending emails at different times. It's just like the slightly more the kind of like hardline one. And I think that's something which you can see the obvious benefit of that is that, like, even if, on the light version, if you get an email asking you to do something, but you don't have to respond, it still often has the same, obviously, mental health strains and pressures. Even if you don't have to respond, particularly if you believe in your work in some sectors, like for example, such as ours, when you actually want to, the organization to succeed, you often feel that pressure anyway. So it's a bit of a balance, which we basically kind of left quite open in our paper. I would also say that on Gmail there is a schedule send option. Just saying, you can schedule sending is something which, as someone who in a leadership position in the organization, I am very well aware that on Slack and on emails, I really try and schedule bits and bobs, because I'm really aware of the fact that I don't people to expect they have to be working just because I'm thinking about work on my downtime, you know. But yeah, Tim, did you have any thoughts on that?
My only thought really was around we should be having a similar discussion when we're thinking about things like, I think the 4-day week campaign, or the idea of 4-day week is a really compelling sort of slogan and sort of tangible, and it's a policy sort of as we used before. But I think we have to think about it in similar terms as we do with this right to disconnect, that actually the 4-day week it'd be fairly irrelevant. You know, I finished 2 days a week. I finish early to pick my, so I can half days can pick my kids up. I don't want to. I'd rather have those than I would do an extra day somewhere. And factory workers already are on shift patterns that don't resemble the 9 to 5. So we just have to be aware. I think some of these campaigns are useful, and sometimes about communicating things well. But I think this idea and that whole principle that when there are productivity gains in the workplace, that some of that should be accruing to workers in part through lower hours. And I think that's all really important. But I think we also have to be very aware about not, and about having the sort of flexibility there. And I think some of the things we can think, I do think there's merits in thinking about things at sectoral level, and the role for I'd be interested to see how New Zealand are bringing in this idea of fair pay agreements in sectors, and whether they can start thinking about appropriate responses in some of the for particular sectors and some of these issues, whether it's the right to connect or working hours, and come up with broad-based solutions that can then be sort of distilled down in particular workplaces. And I think that's one of the things we're keen to see. There's that ability that you have national sort of policies and national laws that you can, but then have the flexibility within collective bargaining arrangements at workplace or sectoral level to add that flexibility and make sure it's responsive to the needs of workers in those areas. I think is also something that we should be thinking about.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Okay, so we're at 6. We said we'd go to 6:15, but we don't have to. Are there any other questions from the chat? I should check that again. Or from the audience at all? Or Phil or Mary-Ann, any reflections on what Tim said? I think actually, Tim, I think what's been a very useful contribution from yourself tonight is also as well the kind of like nuts and bolts things like tribunal resourcing, or these little levers that allow for better representation, kind of movements within just a kind of sectoral organizing. I think that's like some of the stuff that often gets overlooked and is kind of invisibilized by it's like headline policies up here, and there's kind of like at national levels, and there's also kind of we're thinking about improving welfare and so on, but like just unlocking some of those kind of almost kind of nuts and bolts, almost quite grey mechanisms can just make a huge difference. I think that's something which, there's rights, capital R, and there's kind of like let's just make these things much easier, and we can get a lot done. And that's what I've taken away anyway.
Yeah, there's rights, and there isn't that. There's rights, and there's also the ability of people to access those rights. The fact we've had that hollowing out the tribunal system, we've had such inadequate resourcing of state enforcement bodies, we've had whittling away of trade union presence, partly through deliberate laws, partly through the way the labour market has been allowed to develop. All of those things serve to not allow people to exercise existing rights, and I think we need to think about that as well when we think about developing new rights.
I agree completely, and the cut to civil legal aid actually, and the impact that that's had on people's ability to exercise a whole range of rights, not just employment rights. But I mean, one of the problems with the social security system now is you can't get legal aid for social security cases, which means that a whole load of challenges to what the government has done over the last 12 years has been really difficult to take. I don't think they could have had the austerity policies that they'd had if they hadn't also cut civil legal aid, because it would have just been a lot of it would have been ripped to shreds. I know in Coventry, where the Central England Law Centre still actually has lawyers funded by local authorities providing social security advice, they have a 90% success rate in appeal against benefit sanctions, for example. I mean, 90%.
Yeah. It's
just ridiculous.
Yeah. I mean, that's been the case. Like some of the most punitive sanctions, it's almost like every single time they're appealed, it becomes a clear breach of their rights. That's happened. So yeah, absolutely. I would also just say, I guess something almost hidden in the background of all of this as well is that, like, effectively in a low growth, or what's predicted as a kind of a no growth economy, there's obviously the temptation of some to basically say that we can't have nice things because we're not growing as an economy. But the point here is that if it's the case that we're not going to be growing as an economy for up to a decade, maybe more, maybe 20 years, what kind of economy is this in which we can't deliver basic standards in the workplace and outside of it? And so I think it's important to not fall into the trap of just thinking that we have to have a growing economy in order that we can have decent standards at work and outside of work. And so I think part of what the report was trying to do is to show that actually we need to have ambition of what we're demanding and what the policy asks are, and so on, in order that we don't fall into the trap of saying, well, actually, we simply can't have nice things because the economy is not performing well. Well, the economy hasn't been performing well for decades, and we've had a deteriorating set of social, standards. And I think that's something which I think going forward, whether we're heading to another recession or not, we shouldn't fall into the trap again of thinking that we have to kind of kickstart some kind of mythical, growth from 40, 50 years ago in order to just have basic living standards. I think we all know that there's a maldistribution of wealth and income in our society. We know that it's about the distribution of those things, and redistributing, as Mary-Ann said at the very start, is clearly the way to go in order to kind of raise living standards. And whatever this leveling up agenda is, it's got to be something around that. Just never mind the kind of general figures at the top of the economy. So I think that's something which I think that we're all kind of, to some extent, all the things we're talking about to some extent speak to, is that actually we should be asking for more and asking for basic levels as well as for something a bit expanded in order to face the challenges of this century, basically.
In a sense, I'd just add to that is why, in the context of a low growth or no growth economy, the unions become all the more important, because they are one of the few institutions that can represent workers and actually enhance their power. And I think it doesn't seem like at any time soon the government that we have is particularly interested in introducing progressive policy. So it's going to have to come from somewhere else. The pressure is going to have to come from somewhere else. So yeah, I wonder if you've got anything to say on that, Tim.
I think the complete lack of interest in the government in workplace or even indeed economic issues is quite striking. I think you're seeing a bit of a union response to that through the increased focus, particularly on sort of industrial issues. There's a new General Secretary at Unite who's made very clear that she wants to achieve gains for workers through the industrial processes as a priority. And without just wanting to spark a different kind of argument, I think it is really interesting what we're seeing in the gig economy and the sort of deal that we've seen for collective bargaining at Deliveroo today. So, these are platform economy. It's been so hard for unions to organise in these parts of the economy with so many isolated individuals, with hostile employers who won't allow access. Are we perhaps seeing the corner turn to an extent that we have got collective agreements in place at some notable firms? Well, that gives the opportunity for unions to get access to those workers, to recruit them, to build industrial strength, and maybe that is potentially one of the avenues through which we'll achieve some of these, some positive changes. Though obviously we shouldn't be giving up on the political process either.
Tim. Of course, I think we're getting to a discussion about political strategy there, but I think we can all agree that the workplace, and is where this really needs to be perhaps strongest. And of course, we're a think tank. We develop policy for people to pick up and advocate at all levels. So obviously we're thinking about all levels, but I think the workplace, of course, will be the place where these things are won. And we've seen that actually in the pandemic, right? Like there were things like the £15 minimum wage were laughed at by some quarters, but then picked up by trade unions. I'm thinking of the Bakers Union and others as well, and then won, and many Unite as well, in many workplaces and sectors that actually that came about. I think about truck drivers and so on. And so those kind of things, which at a national level, even though they polled well, politicians were sneering at, ultimately then became the kind of sticking point for organising. So I think that's let's leave that as a kind of positive ending note for this discussion. And I'd like to thank Mary-Ann, Tim, and obviously Phil for the report, but also for the discussion tonight. And thanks everyone for joining. It's been recorded. We'll upload it soon, so you can kind of listen back. Yeah, enjoy your evening and the rest of your week, and have a good weekend. Hopefully it'll be a 3-day weekend, not too soon, not too long. Cheers, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Right, thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.